I had an elementary knowledge of poetry. I knew Allen Ginsberg's Howl and E. E. Cummings. I didn't know of Ron Padgett's poems that appear in Paterson in the New York school. Jim also turned me on to Frank O'Hara because we were trying to tell a story about someone who had structured their physical life and could go on autopilot. I had to put in the rhythms of someone who does this every day. Those are words from actor Adam Driver on Jim Jarmusch's 2016 film Paterson. Seeing Faces in Movies is a podcast where each month I focus on the works of a different director or cinematographer, and each week I invite a guest on to discuss the film and the artist's filmography. I'm your host, Felicia, and we're talking Paterson today. So, quick synopsis of the film is a quiet observation of triumphs and defeats of daily life, along with the poetry evident in its smallest details. It's a story about a man named Paterson, who's a bus driver in a city called Paterson. The film stars Adam Driver as Paterson, Golshifteh Farahani as Laura, Barry Shabaka Henley as Doc, William Jackson Harper as Everett, and Chasten Harmon as Murray. It's written by Jim Jarmusch, cinematography by Frederick Elms, directed by Jim Jarmusch, edited by Afonso Gonçalves, music by Jim Jarmusch, Carter Logan, and Squirrel. So today my guest is Josh Cooley, and I know Josh from the Royal Film Club, and he is someone who I love his vibe because he's in film school, and it reminds me of my excitement of when I entered film school. So it's always a joy to have him in the club and just in general. So first of all, Josh, thank you so much for joining. It's been a long time coming.
Thank you for inviting me. This is good. I'm excited to do this.
No, yeah, I mean, I knew that you loved Jarmusch, so it was a no-brainer to ask you on for this month. But before we get into the film, I'd love to hear about, your beginnings, in cinema. How did you start sort of watching films, and what led you to enroll in film school?
Yeah, I think it's hard to pinpoint a beginning to when I started liking movies. It was just kind of a natural progression that happened throughout my childhood, because my parents were very much in the mindset of I want to raise my children to appreciate the arts, and it's led to all of my siblings being artists, and so
that's cool.
I think we all kind of gravitated towards a particular art. And so mine was always movies, because from a young age, I was always I love telling stories. And I was always the kid in elementary school that would make up these outlandish stories on the playground because I thought they were fun. And then I was like, oh, I could do this for a living. I think my discovery of film really took off in 2018 to 2019. There was a string of movies that came out around that time that just immediately made me realize that cinema is less of just a way to pass the time and more of a definitive art form. And I just hit the ground running from there. When COVID hit, I had so much time and so little to do. And so I just I made a list of all the movies I wanted to see, and I just grinded out each one. There were days where I was watching 4 or 5 movies a day. And I think that if it wasn't for all the movies I was watching, COVID would have been a much more rough time for me. And so I think, cinema kind of helped me through times, helped me through the tough times, helped me through the good times. So it just felt like a no-brainer. And then by high school, I realized that I had a passion for filmmaking as well, because I really wanted to have my stories be told. And so going to film school was just the biggest no-brainer. And so I just did the application process and got into a really great school, and I've loved it. It's been an amazing experience ever since I've started. It's been a lot of work, but it's been really good to just figure out what I'm doing with this love of mine and figuring out how to achieve what I want with that.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I think that it's rare enough that people get to go to school for something they're actually passionate about. So it's also brave to do that. No, especially
right
in today's world. So I definitely am pro that, of course. How long until you're graduated?
I graduate in 2026. So I'm a current sophomore in film school. So I'm pretty early on in my journey. So, well, I guess I'm not early on anymore. I'm halfway through.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. I didn't even think about that.
That's exciting. That's cool. And you've already made films.
Yes, I have a short film that I've been working on. We might put the link in the show notes, depending on the film festival run for the film. And I have a new project on the way. By the time this releases, there should be a fundraiser up for that. It's gonna be a different film than what I've done before, but I'm really excited to do it. So more
Amazing.
information about that in the future.
I'm looking forward to that. Today, we're here to talk about Paterson. I know you're a big fan of Jarmusch.
Huge fan.
Do you recall the first time you watched this film, though, and what your initial thoughts were on that watch?
I could tell you exactly how I felt watching this movie. So my first time watching this was my early on in my senior year of high school. I rented this from my favorite video store, Movie Madness Video. If you
Mm,
live in Portland, you know what's up. But Movie Madness was an amazing spot, and people kept saying like, "Oh, you're gonna love Paterson." And so I rented it and I had it on my shelf, and it came to me at the perfect moment because it's hard to talk about my first watch of Paterson without getting a little bit personal. But to sum it up,
mhm.
I had just gotten rejected from what I thought was my dream film school. And I was in a weird spot at the moment. And then I put on Paterson, and I think immediately it was a film that reminded me of like the small beauties of living. And I think it was exactly what I needed in that moment. And so from that point onward, I just kind of save Paterson. Like when I'm in a spot where I'm not appreciating the small beauties of life, I put on Paterson. And immediately after, I'm like in a state of like, man, things are great. Like it's
No.
such a comforting and heartwarming movie for me in particular. And I think every time it just hits the same. And it's just such a nice little slice of life movie. And you don't really get a lot of those. And I think that Jarmusch does this style of slice of life movie the best out of everyone that I've seen.
I think that's a really beautiful way to view the film because it is kind of one that makes you appreciate your life and just kind of living your everyday life, which
Mm-hmm.
we'll get into. But yeah, I know that I first saw this. I was living in Ireland at the time, and my roommate, we were just like, let's go see something at the cinema, and Patterson happened to be on. And I was already a Jarmusch fan at that point, but I loved it. But I was curious to see what my friend thought because it's not typically the type of movie that she likes, and she loved it too. She just found it so comforting, and she couldn't stop
Mm-hmm.
talking about it. So I think it's a really great film, and I will say I loved it the first time, and it really hit me harder this time. Like it was really
Mm-hmm.
what I needed when I watched it
Mm-hmm.
that day.
Yeah. Patterson is so fun to show to friends. I think I showed it to a lot of people in film school because everyone's like, "Oh, what are your favorite movies?" And I'm like, "Oh, I got a good one." And I put it on for them, and the reactions are always like really positive, and
Yeah.
everybody seems to love it. There's a film club on our campus that screens movies that had a personal impact on people, and I've suggested Patterson like 7 or 8 times now, and they still haven't gotten back to me. So I hope they get back to me
Yeah.
because I really want to show that to people because I think more people need to see it. I think more people need to experience it.
I agree. I think it's one that people don't talk about as much when they're talking about his body of work, unfortunately,
Hmm.
despite the
Hmm.
fact that it made a big enough wave when it came out. And it also stars, Adam Driver, who is even bigger now than he was then. Ahead of getting into the film, I am curious to know how you got into Jarmusch and, what was the first film you saw and
Okay. Trying to remember if Patterson was the first. I think I
mm,
saw. No, it was not the first. The first one I saw was Dead Man. Because I was doing a series at that point where I was watching all the different films that were shot in Oregon because Dead Man is shot in the woods
okay.
of Oregon, and so I just found it on a whim. I was like, "Ooh, this is a fun, quirky little western," and I had a great time with it. But I think Paterson was the film that really cemented my love of Jarmusch. And then I remember the next time I went to Movie Madness, I got 3 more Jarmusch films and watched them back to back in one day. And
Not,
those 3 were Mystery Train, Night on Earth, and oh gosh, what was the third one? Oh, Only Lovers Left Alive. And I've talked a lot about my love of Mystery Train in the film club too. I even recommended it
mhm.
for one of our discussions. But Paterson and Mystery Train are like the 2 Jarmusch films that I think defined my watching of his filmography.
I mean, I think that's like a well-rounded vision of what he has to offer. So
Hmm.
I can't think of a single Jarmusch film that I dislike. I think they've all hit.
Have you seen The Dead Don't Die?
I haven't seen that one yet. I'm going to
Okay, well
watch it
that's why.
through
Well
this
that's why.
series.
It's it's not terrible, but like it's definitely Jarmusch's weakest film. And the whole time watching it, I'm like I was not having it because I was like I
Mm,
usually love every Jarmusch film that's put in front of me, and this one was like I still think it's a little bit overhated, but I also think
yeah.
that it's definitely his weakest film.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, if you're ready to get into Paterson, we've been kind of touching upon it, but if ready
Let's
to
get
get
into
into the
it.
film itself, one of the first things I want to talk about, which kind of relates to a lot of his work and the way people view him, but specifically with this one, it's kind of like a mood piece type of film. It's
Hmm.
very relaxed. To some people, it might not seem like there's a point to the story, even though I definitely think there is, but it's
Hmm.
following this character throughout his work week essentially, and we're just following his everyday life. And that's something that Jarmusch loves to do in his films. He loves just following people and watching them.
Hmm.
How do you feel this fits within his filmography, and specifically as it relates to his films that are more so mood pieces?
Yeah, I think that Paterson is like the perfect representation of what I think Jarmusch does best. I think your point that like he kind of just watches people, it's almost like there are moments in Jarmusch films where it's like a really polished like cinema verite type movie where it's like you're a fly on a wall watching people, you're just observing the world as it passes. And I think that those movies that Jarmusch has done, this Paterson and Mystery Train are like the two big ones.
Hmm.
It's purely just people living their lives and doing normal, ordinary things. And I think that Jarmusch is at his best when he's more of an observer of these characters and less of playing an active role in what they're doing.
I agree. I think that's probably the best way to put it. And this is very much a story where they're following the lives of like everyday people.
Mm-hmm.
You would come across a Patterson. You probably have come across a Patterson
Mm-hmm.
and you wouldn't necessarily notice them because there's nothing necessarily remarkable on the surface about them, but everyone has beauty within their lives.
I think that that's what Patterson does so brilliantly, though, is it kind of makes the unremarkable person seem more remarkable because it
Hmm.
gives these characters these dreams and these desires that other filmmakers wouldn't think about. Because, like in any other movie, the bus driver would be a side character, and I think Jarmusch made the intentional decision to just really hone in on that. Be like, the bus driver is our protagonist, and he lives a boring and ordinary life, but the point he's making is like, but that's good. That's okay. That's a good thing to have is mundanity. And I think this film really shows that.
I think that it's exactly that. You know, we're all living what we think are boring lives, but
Hmm.
they could be turned into a movie and they would be interesting some people to watch. And you see that with every character, not just Patterson, but all the characters that he comes across. Like as you said, he's a bus driver and we watch his everyday routine. He gets up super early, obviously, for his route. He
Hmm.
walks to work. You see him observing the people along his route, and he kind of has the same routine every day, down to like one of my favorite parts of his day is when he comes home and he has to fix the mailbox every time. And he just
Hmm.
loves, it's like he has to do it. And like that might seem boring to most people, but I just find it fascinating to watch that. But even the characters he comes across on his walks, either to work or at night when he's walking the dog or at the bar, they're all just snippets of their lives, but they seem so interesting. And I think it takes a lot of craft to be able to do that because I know a lot of people have tried to do it. It doesn't succeed as well.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting because now that I'm like really thinking about it, there's a lot of like even this less important characters in this story about less important people still have
Hmm.
really interesting story arcs shown within, and you kind of get an idea on their exact motivations and their feelings as well. I think the big one is the love story between that couple that keeps fighting at the bar and then he
Yeah.
pulls out the toy gun. I think that arc is so interesting, and I think it's almost like that's the level of absurdity that the film needed amidst some of the mundanity of the characters' lives. But there's also that sense of just like routine in this film, in the sense that in all 7 days, so the same events for the most part happen. It's very simple. It's, he gets up at the same time, has a brief conversation with his wife, then goes to work, then fixes the mailbox, then goes to the bar. I think that there's something in there about the absurdity of those two characters mixed in with the sort of mundanity of the rest.
I was reading an article and it'll be in the show notes. It's escaping me right now what platform I read it on, but they were saying that, as you said, it's mainly the lives and like the mundanity of their lives, but then there's little snippets of absurd moments in the film, but they
Mhm.
don't really take you out of it. It's kind of like a bit of a relief to make sure that,
Yeah.
or so like the scene that you're talking about with the gun, but also the scene where when Paterson's walking the dog and a car pulls up and there's like four
Mhm.
guys in the car and they
Mhm.
say that like dogs like that get stolen. And in any other film, you're like, okay, well, we're gonna see those guys again and they're gonna steal this dog. But it never happens, right?
Mhm.
It just was like a funny little thing. And I think that people think that Jarmusch is super serious, but I don't think he is. He's very silly sometimes.
No, he's Jarmusch is I've always seen him as just like this quirky style of humor
Hmm.
because I think what you're saying is like the dog like the dog nappers as they're called, I guess. I put
Yeah.
quotation marks around that. It's such a surreal scene because it's just like and like you said it never takes you out of the film. It just kind of adds this level of color to a film that feels kind of dry. It's like adding the M&Ms to the trail mix. I feel like that's a good way to describe it. Is it's like it's a very dry movie. It's a very straightforward to the point movie. It needs those breaks from just people living their lives and having these like little absurd moments because at the end of the day, film should be like if you make a film that's just people living their lives, it's going to be a little bit on the boring side. I think he adds those to make
Hmm.
them intentionally less boring because some of the things I've heard from people when I showed them this movie was that they expected it to be boring, but were thoroughly engaged the whole way through. And I think those little moments, those little absurd moments where you're reminded, like, oh yeah, I'm watching a movie made by somebody who cares about these characters, it adds so much in the end to what is happening in the story.
Yeah, I think that's definitely his forte. And I think it's interesting that you kind of paired this with Mystery Train because that's always kind of the movie I think about when I'm watching this. And he does it quite a bit in that because, as we said, like they're just following three sets of characters essentially. And it could be boring, but there's definitely moments of absurdity. Obviously, the third act is probably the most
Hmm.
absurd in
Hmm.
that film. But the first couple acts do have moments of levity and humor.
Yeah, like the Elvis ghost in the room.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that that's kind of why the third act of Mystery Train doesn't work as well for me as the first two, is that it goes off the deep end and like actually has a cohesive plot that isn't just rooted in
Hmm.
people living their lives. And I think that's what makes Jarmusch so interesting is that he weaves together these complex ideas and plots in simple actions. And I think as much as I adore Mystery Train, it's one of my favorite movies of all time as well. Mystery Train the third act does lose a little bit of the momentum that the first two acts set up because the first two acts are a lot like Paterson in the sense that
Yeah.
they're just rooted in this they're really grounded in reality and then there's these weird quirky moments that happen that bring you back into it. It's a lot like Paterson. But the third act is like if the absurdity moments in the first two acts were an entire act. I still love it. I still think it works for me, but it does lose like a tiny bit of momentum. Like if the first two acts were one movie, it would be in my top 10 movies of all time. But
Yeah.
because of that third act, it's still really high up, still one of my favorite movies of all time,
Hmm.
but it's not as high up as it would be.
Yeah. That's fair. One of the other parts that we kind of touched upon, well, so this film is called Paterson, character is called Paterson.
Mhm.
There's a poem by William Carlos William that's very prevalent in this and is told throughout. And I read somewhere that someone said that the film is kind of a visual, continuation of that poem. I managed to read it. It's quite short and it's interesting, and you hear it quite a bit throughout the film as well. But the city of Paterson is kind of its own character in this
Mhm.
film, and we're
Mhm.
seeing everyone's passion. It's not like the passion in, I know we keep mentioning Mystery Train, where these are all kind of outsiders. Well, these are first two acts, outsiders who are just fascinated by going to the city. These are people who live in the city and they're just kind of proud of the achievements of
Mhm.
the people who've gone there because it's a bit of a smaller city in New Jersey. I love when Jarmusch makes the characters or the city its own character. How do you feel about the way it's handled in this film?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a reverse of Mystery Train in that sense, in that Mystery Train is a lot about idealism and like people idolizing a city that's kind of gross. And like I think
Yeah.
the DP for Mystery Train, I know you did a whole series on him, Robbie Mueller. He did such a great job capturing the grossness of the city as well, but like also Jarmusch is like having these characters idolize this city as some amazing place. I think that Paterson, it's also kind of a rundown city in the sense that like it's trapped in the past, but at the same time, the way that it's shot and the way that it's done, there's just so much beauty in everything. Like the scenes where he's on the park bench looking over at the waterfalls in the city and like contrasting that with like the buildings with the faded paint on the bricks. It's very different from Mystery Train in that it's not trying to idealize this city. It's just kind of more about contentment and where you are rather than trying to go somewhere else.
It's interesting that you brought up Robbie Mueller because that was one of the points I was going to bring up because this film is obviously shot on digital versus some of his older films.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the stuff with Mueller would have been shot on film. In this film, he's working with Frederick Elms, who he's worked with before. I know he did do The Dead Don't Die and he shot Broken Flowers. It's obviously quite visually different than the older stuff. And there's some shots that are very beautiful and remarkable in it. So I went and looked to see what else he shot. So outside of those ones, he also shot stuff like Blue Velvet.
Oh, okay.
So it's really great what he did with this. And he makes the city not seem more beautiful than it actually is, but he captures the beauty in certain areas, the beauty that Paterson's seeing.
He sees it as beautiful as it is. It's not like,
yes.
Yeah, there's the waterfall, and then I just go back to the waterfall and the bricks and like the parallel between those two and where we are in the story.
Yeah, those are the most remarkable places, and that's why Paterson is gravitating towards those places in the city. But when he's on the bus driving around, the few outside shots that we get, it doesn't look ugly, but it just looks like a regular city that's not remarkable in any way, and I love that. And I love that we get to see Paterson's vision of the city in this, you know, what he actually sees on his everyday life, because he actively chooses to eat his lunch at certain areas, write in certain areas, but most of his day is taking place throughout whatever his bus route is in the city. So I find that really interesting. Another huge part I did mention that the title of the film is taken from the poem. Poetry is obviously a huge part in this film. Paterson is a poet as much as he would like to think that he's not. He's modest about it. He's always writing. He's always in his head writing, and he's actually physically writing. He takes time throughout his day to write down his poems that he's working on. The poems that Paterson writes are actually real poems by a poet called Ron Padgett, which I found was interesting. I guess Jarmusch just been good friends with him, and he allowed him to use his poems because I was wondering who wrote them. I know the one that the young girl wrote, Jarmusch wrote himself, but the other ones are Ron Padgett. In terms of the theme of poetry throughout this, how do you feel that it works? Because a lot of it's told through voiceover, and I know a lot of people have problems with voiceover. I don't think it's overdone in this film. I think it works really well, but I'm wondering how you feel.
Yeah, I think I'm a little biased towards voiceover because one of my favorite filmmakers is Wong Kar-wai, and he uses voiceover a lot. And like, if you're able to capture the poetic beauty of the scene with voiceover, I never have a problem with it. And I think that that's what Paterson is doing with the voiceover. A lot of the poetry, I've had a lot of people say that it's rough around the edges, but I think that I find it beautiful in a way where it's like this character is just like letting his feelings out. And you know, all good art is stemming from emotion, and it's clear that his poems are stemming from the emotions of like how he's feeling with like his feelings of love. And I think the poems are like the emotional grounding of the film because they're used in a way that it brings out the emotion that's needed to keep the film moving forward, in the sense that, again, Paterson is a very dry movie, and the poem scenes are like the moments where we kind of detach from the reality for a bit and just listen to the words flow. And sometimes they'll cut to like waterfalls and other places. It's basically his escape from the reality that he's in. And I think that as a writer, it's a really beautiful thing to see it that way, because like I relate to Paterson in that way, where it's like my scripts aren't the greatest scripts ever written, but like they all stem from emotions I've felt and things that I've done. So it's all in the sense that like writing is his escape from reality. And I think that as someone who really wants to be, well, really wants to create art and is stuck at a mundane job, I can relate to Paterson on a very personal level because of that.
Same here. That's why I think it hits even harder because I'm older than I was when I first watched it
Mm.
and different place in my life and definitely a much more boring job than I had before when I was a bit younger. So it hit a lot harder. But I like what you said about the poetry stemming from the heart. And yeah, I could see how people would find it dry. I think a lot of people, when they think poem, they think rhyming as opposed to like
Mm.
a stream of consciousness, which is more so what Patterson's doing, just getting his thoughts out. And I love that because I think for him, why he doesn't, necessarily consider himself a poet, it's because it's something just for him. As you said, it's just
Mm.
something to separate himself from his everyday life. And his partner, Laura, is constantly, they're very supportive of each other. And
Mm.
I love that. It's because I think we're so used to just not even just in real life, but in film, seeing couples who they might seem one person seems like they're more serious than the other. You just expect something bad to happen at the end because it seems like he's supporting her and she's a bit more aloof and more in tune with her artistry, and she's kind of pushing him to be more accepting of it. So she keeps asking him to photocopy his
Mm.
work so he doesn't lose it. He eventually kind of agrees, but obviously we know he's not going to do it. And
Mm.
unfortunately, he loses the work. It's a dog.
Oh, that moment. The first time I saw Paterson, I was like, it's the weirdest thing because like I'm not like somebody who gets particularly like outwardly emotional during movies, like meaning I don't usually cry during movies. But
Hmm.
somehow, like when the poems got ripped, was like, man, all of his work and all the dreams that he had are gone. And like it was such a weird emotional experience for me watching that the first time because it was like it's such an ordinary thing to happen, but it's
Yeah,
like that was his escape from the reality that he's in. And it's like his reality is negative, but like it's something greater.
I agree. I also felt really sad for him. I think that's like Adam Driver's perfect throughout, but I think that was like the best scene acting wise for him because his reaction is so genuine and real. He
Hmm.
didn't blow up. He didn't get angry. He just looks like he's in shock and he's trying to deny how important the work was to him. And you can see him battling with that and being like trying to play it off like it's not a big deal, but obviously it's a huge deal. But
Hmm.
he's not the type, it would have been so out of character for him to just blow up because he's not that person.
Yeah,
Right.
it's just such a calm movie, and like if the characters blew up, then it would really amount to nothing. I'd feel because
Hmm.
it's very much about yeah, his whole character is just like what it is. Whatever happens, happens. It's like
Yeah.
things constantly happen around him, but like he never gets upset. He's kind of just content with everything going happening around him. Like when the bus breaks down, like he's just kind of problem solving immediately, and then he's like, "Let me figure this out. We'll get there." And then we'll go from there. But I think that with the poems, even though it is like his one escape, if he had blown up, it wouldn't the character arc would not be the same because his whole character arc is based around the it is what it is mindset.
I think the ending scene, which we will get to, or the scene just before the ending with the guest, the stranger, it would have had less effect if he had like blown up and stormed off. So
Yeah.
I do want to talk about Laura because I find her to be a very interesting character because she's obviously very different than everyone else and very different than Patterson. I think they're perfect match for each other, but
Hmm.
she's someone I find I admire a lot because I think we all can relate to someone who has all these dreams and aspirations and like one day you want to be a musician, one day you want to be an artist or and you're like I can
Hmm.
be all these things, and she's acting on those things, actively trying to get to that place, and it might seem like a lot to some people and most people would just be like pick one thing, but she's like why do I have to just pick one thing? And I think that she's a very beautiful character. How do you feel about her character in contrast to Patterson?
I think that when you're writing films, you always want to have supporting characters that drive the emotional core of the film forward. And I think that is exactly what Laura is there to do, narratively speaking. I think
Hmm.
that her whole perspective of like having so many different dreams and aspirations is such a beautiful contrast with Paterson's, life's good where we are at right now mentality. And I think that usually in movies when there's that much contrast, there's usually some kind of tension in the relationship, and there's a lot of like fallout between these two characters. That's how a lot of movies are structured. What makes Paterson so unique and different is that these two characters are very different in a lot of different ways, and yet they can still support each other. And that's one of those things about like the small beauties of life that I mentioned earlier. Is it's like the beauty of like realizing that people who aren't always alike can still support each other and respect each other. I think that is a beautiful part of this movie. And I think that Laura's character is very much trying to convey the emotion of that love can really transcend over interests and agreements and like life philosophies sometimes. It's like these two characters are clearly in love with each other and they clearly are two different personalities in the sense that one is constantly trying new things and can almost feel like a walking identity crisis at some points. And then you
Yeah.
have Paterson, who is rigid and the same, wakes up at the same time, does the same things every day. And again, I think it goes back to that the mundanity versus absurdity that Paterson is presenting, in that Laura's character is trying to break the tediousness of the day, and her character is different every day, as opposed to Paterson, who kind of, I don't want to say that he stays the same, but like he's very similar from each day.
I mean, they're definitely one of my favorite on-screen couples. And I
Absolutely.
love what you said that like they're very much in love with each other and they support each other. And it's not even shown through grand gestures because we don't really see them outside of the home. We get the little snippets when he comes home from work and they're chatting and they're having dinner and she's telling him about her day because she stays at home and she works on her projects and he goes out and works. And it's just the love that he has for her and the love that she has for him is just so apparent by the way they talk to each other and listen to each other. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's just so rare to see. I mean, I can only aspire to write, a couple like that.
Yeah, it's so subtle, and it's weird for me like to like see that love story as like this really beautiful thing, because a lot of my favorite love stories in film are about these grand gestures in a sense. I think that Wong Kar-wai's filmography is obviously a huge influence on me, and I think that his films are just like this poetic beauty, and I think that there's a Wong Kar-wai-esque aspect of love in this film, and that it doesn't necessarily make rational sense as to like why, like again, they're just so different in terms of how they are as people, but there's also that poetic beautiful sense that love is more important, and it gives a sense of stability, and it gives a sense of respect and trust and friendship and intimacy with another person.
Yeah. Which is, yeah, I think that people don't give him enough credit for his writing.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
again, I loved everything else that he's written, but I think this is probably his best written work,
I agree.
at least in my opinion. One of the last points I wanted to talk about that I really found interesting, and I had kind of forgotten it from my first watch, and then on this recent one, it really stuck out to me was the motif of the twins in this,
Hmm.
which I love.
Hmm.
So it stems from her, usually when he's getting up for work, they kind of have a little bit of a chat in bed. She stays in bed and he gets up and she'll usually tell him about a dream she's had. And she tells him one day about a dream that she had twins. And then he keeps seeing twins throughout the day. And it's just like, it's such a Jarmusch thing to do to have something like that come up and it not be, you know, it's not pointed out so much that you're like, okay, I need to pay attention to this. It's just more,
Yeah.
it happens on the background. Obviously, you noticed it. How do you feel about that reoccurrence of the twins?
I love the way that Jarmusch layers it in throughout the entire film, because like usually a director will like have that in occasionally at towards the beginning, because like the twins conversation is like one of the first conversations of the movie, and
Hmm.
the fact that the twin motif lasts until pretty much until the end of the movie, but it also comes back to the theme of dreams, because like the first conversation is about a dream that she had, and then seeing the twins is like a reminder of the dreams that both of them share, and it comes back to their their love for each other is. It's like you almost wonder if like Paterson shares the same dreams that she does, in the sense that like this is something that she might want, and this is something that he is starting to contemplate and want. It's one of those things where it's like when something is primed in your mind, you think
Hmm.
about it a lot and you notice things that you wouldn't have noticed otherwise. Like I think what like you watch a movie and you notice something in that. You watch a movie that you love, and then you go into the next movie and you notice the things that it did that the movie you watched before did.
Yeah.
It's that sense of like he hears this and is like, that's an interesting dream that you had. And then it's Jarmusch's way of showing his contemplation of that without him talking about it.
Yes. I think that's exactly that. That's really well put. I loved it. I love noticing it even more this time because, as you said, it's very subtle, but it's telling us more about the character that without them having to say it. And I think my favorite type of films are ones that I notice something new on each watch. And I'm sure the
Mm-hmm.
next time I watch
Mm-hmm.
this, I'll notice something I never noticed before.
Yep.
So I think there's just so much going on in this film, and a film that on the surface is kind of, in quotes, boring, even though we don't find it boring.
Not in the slightest. I find it more interesting than 90% of movies, just in general.
Yep, I agree. Are there any parts of the filmmaking, the story that we haven't chatted about that you want to bring up?
I think we should talk about the conversation on the bench. I think that is an important aspect of the film that really drives home the points that they're
Hmm.
approaching, because it almost comes back to Mystery Train. And I know we bring up Mystery Train a lot, but it does tie really well into Paterson, and I'll get to that
Hmm.
later. But it ties back into that because this character is this outsider looking in, and he's the one idealizing this mundane town, and you get this new
Yeah.
perspective of just like this, and it's his perspective that reminds you of all the small beauties in life. That it's and that scene is the reason why this film hits so well emotionally, is because it's just kind of them sitting there talking about life, talking about like the dreams and desires of them, and then the way that it ends with him giving Paterson the blank canvas.
Yeah.
It's such a beautiful way to be like, it's almost like a like follow your dreams type thing, but it's more like a, this is something that needs to be done, and you need to complete this. And so, but it's also just like these characters live this mundane life in this mundane town, and they do the same things, but then you get this outsider perspective, and it's like all of the beauty is always around you, whether you see it or not. And even in towns that like aren't considered great towns. I mean, like you said earlier, Paterson is very much a not bad looking town, but it's very much like every small town in America combined into
Hmm.
one town. And I think that that idea is really beautiful in the sense that like this character sees so much in this town that just looks like every other American town, and he's there for like for the poetry. I can't remember which poet he was obsessing over, but he's just like, this is where this poet came from, and like this is a beautiful place.
I love that. I think it's interesting that it ends with that interaction because, as you said, he's an outsider, and with Patterson's thinking it, we're also kind of thinking it. Why would you travel from, you know,
Mhm.
anywhere to come to a town like that? I think
Yeah,
we can all relate to that if wherever, whatever city we're from.
yeah, and it comes to the absurdity again. I think it comes to like this character could have gone literally anywhere, but he chose Paterson, New Jersey, this little town in the middle of nowhere. It's like if I were like wanting to like plan a destination and went to like small town Nebraska. It's like
Yeah.
why would I do that? It's such a he's such a strange character in that sense, and that like he like there's so much to explore in America, and he chose this place that doesn't, quote unquote, doesn't really matter that much, like it's not like one of the
Hmm.
tourist cities.
I think it's important also because it brings Patterson back to where he needs to be because he is an outsider. Because Patterson's so used to everyone that he sees on his regular day, even though he is a bus driver and he's seeing people that he doesn't necessarily see
Hmm.
every day. He's bringing, but the people he interacts with to the point where he doesn't own a cell phone because he's like, well, I'm always doing the same exact thing. I don't need one. He
Yeah,
doesn't want one. Right. So having an outsider bring him back to life essentially because he meets him after his notebook's been ripped up, and him giving him the blank canvas, as he said, just kind of reminds him that it's not over just because those poems are gone for now doesn't mean that passion needs to be gone too. It's really beautiful.
Yeah, it's almost like this character is reminding him to have a fresh start on life. Because I like what you were saying about him kind of being in his own world and then having to be drawn back. Because when you're in your own world, a lot of times it's the outside perspectives that bring you back to reality and not your own. Because like, like sometimes when things don't go according to plan, it can be easy. It's hard to hear the opinions of people you trust. But then the second you hear an opinion from someone you don't trust that has like a totally different viewpoint that you've never heard before, all of a sudden things start making sense and you start coming back to reality. And I think that the realization I'm making right now is that is what the tourist is doing, is bringing him back to the reality of the situation, in that the thing that made him happiest was the poetry where he could escape the mundanity of life, but at the same time also be happy in the beauty of everything that he's doing and everything that he's seeing. Because like the poets, like the tourists seeing the beauty and everything, gave Paterson the ability to see that same beauty in not just other people, but in where he is and what he's doing.
And as you said, like he does do the poetry to escape, but like we don't mean it in a way that he's escaping something that he dislikes. He doesn't dislike his life, but everyone needs something outside of their everyday routine, right? Something that's to themselves.
For me, filmmaking is like my escape, but like again, it's not like, and that's really the beauty of this film, is it's capturing every moment and everything that you do as something that is beautiful, despite it feeling ordinary. Because like everybody expresses themselves, but like the way that Paterson expresses himself is an escape to a reality that he doesn't even need to escape, but it elevates it still.
Exactly. I think it just allows him to express how he feels about the things that he loves, which is his surroundings and his partner, who he loves a lot, but may not. He's a very reserved guy, right? He's comfortable around her, but he's still very reserved, and this is his way of expressing, himself. Because at some point he's writing a poem and a love poem to her, and he never reads it to her, but it's still, she loves the fact that he's written it. He's, at all. So I love that, and I love the ending. I think it's really powerful. Just also kind of peak Jarmusch. He loves an outsider coming in. So, any other parts that we haven't touched yet?
I think we've kind of covered everything that I want to talk about. This is such a small thing, but it gets me every time. So the second time I watched this with a girl I was interested in dating at the time, and we were just like locked in, ready to go. And the way that Adam Driver said the word pumpkin, we both just like lost our minds. It was such a weird moment where it was like such a serious scene, and then like the way that Adam Driver said pumpkin, for some reason and every time I watch the movie from now on, I hear the word pumpkin and I'm like, it makes me laugh. And I think it comes back to like Adam Driver's performance it's very subtle. It's very subtle, but it's kind of quirky in weird ways too. Like I think a few scenes that come to mind with Adam Driver's performance is like obviously the scene where his poems are destroyed and like he's in this state of contemplativeness where he's like not exploding or being angry, kind of being like, what happened? But there's also just scenes where it's like he's just not comfortable showing his emotions as fully. I think the scene where Laura makes the pie, the special pie, and it's like clear that he doesn't like it, and he's just like, but he's like trying to be nice and is just like saying somewhat nice things. It's those moments that are just so fun and quirky, and I think that's why I believe I've never heard people say that Jim Jarmusch is a serious filmmaker, and the reason why is because I just see his little quirks in everything he does. He's a very quirky guy, and just as a person, and it translates well into his films. It's a subtle quirkiness. It's not like an active, like it's not like a Wes Anderson type quirkiness where it's apparent in everything. It's like it's in there. It's baked, but it's really baked into it. And it's like you can sort of taste the quirkiness, but it's not as potent as it is in other films. And I think that's why Jarmusch might be considered more serious, is that he's not as
Hmm.
outwardly quirky about the things that he's doing. And I think my next short film is trying to capture that quirkiness a lot, because it's a philosophical conversation between different friends, but there's this underlying bit of quirkiness in the short film I'm working on that I'm saying is inspired by Jarmusch, because every film I'm making in film school is kind of my tribute to a filmmaker that inspired me. And so Jarmusch's quirkiness is like the main thing I see him for now, because
Yeah.
of all the subtleties of it.
I love that you mentioned Wes Anderson because, well, for two reasons. I do kind of associate them as having similarities, but they're kind of the opposite sides of the
Mm-hmm.
coin.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, as you said, they're both very quirky, but one is more overt than the other about it. But I think they are very similar filmmakers down to like, not in this film, but in other films, the more big ensemble cast that he uses
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and has people coming through. But there's also, Paterson likes to listen in on the conversations that happens on his bus. And one of the conversations is the two actors from Moonrise Kingdom, and they're obviously older at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that's like a favorite point of a lot of people, but I remember the first time watching it being like, are those the kids from Moonrise Kingdom? I was like, okay.
I didn't even notice until just now. I'm like, wow, you're talking about the one with the communists or the
Yeah.
anarchists, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
I did not run that through my brain until just now, that those were the kids from Moonrise Kingdom.
So I thought that was really interesting that he did that. And then it reminded me even more. I was like, yeah,
Whoa. Okay.
they must be like buddies of some sorts. I feel like they're probably good friends who they must be. They're
Yeah.
so similar.
They came from that same era of filmmaking, that late 80s to mid
Hmm.
90s era, where like people were where expressiveness and quirkiness was king. Like you got like tons of quirky filmmakers from that era. You got like Tarantino, Paul Thomas Anderson, like those filmmakers as
Hmm.
well. I think that out of those, I relate to Jarmusch's quirkiness the most, but I also respect the quirkiness of the other filmmakers as well. I think, but it's just that era. And like even
Yeah.
smaller filmmakers like Eric Romer, Hal Hartley, like those filmmakers from that era, they remind me a lot of Jarmusch as well, in that they just have like these crazy characters doing crazy things.
Those are great comparisons too. I like both of them. And I don't know, I never associated them. So that's really interesting that you brought
Mm.
them up.
Every time I watch a Hal Hartley movie, I think of Jarmusch, because like
Yeah.
his films are just so rooted in ordinary people's stories.
Hmm.
At least the ones that I like are like that. But he's more outwardly quirky than Jarmusch too, because like he takes these ridiculous stories and then just lets the characters go wild. I think I've been getting really into Hal Hartley's films recently. I think he's an amazing filmmaker. I
Hmm.
wish he hired better crews to shoot his films, because his films sometimes can be badly shot or badly edited. But that's the film student in me, understanding how editing and cinematography work and realizing what works and what doesn't.
It's definitely an unsung hero of American cinema of that era for sure.
100%, 100%.
Well, I think that was Paterson. I think we covered it, and my assumption always is that people have seen the film, but I think what we're saying essentially is that this is a very rewatchable film, and definitely go
Absolutely.
rewatch it and
Mhm.
discover new things that you didn't see the first time. But before I let you go, I do have the last segment of the show, and I ask every guest the same two questions. So the first one I'll start off with, we've been talking about Jarmusch and you've seen a lot of his films. If someone wanted to start watching his films, what film would you recommend they start with, and what's the reason for that?
This is such a hard question, because like
Yeah.
for me, like what Jarmusch is are the two films that I've mentioned the most in this episode. Like Paterson, obviously, that's the episode. But, throughout this whole episode, I've compared it with Mystery Train. And I think both of those movies would be really great starting points. I do think that Paterson weaves a lot of the films of Jarmusch in a more compelling way
Hmm.
for me. The themes of like the outsider looking in, the fly on the wall perspective, the subtle beauties in ordinary events. I think that Paterson does all of that better than anything else that Jarmusch has made.
Hmm.
So personally, I think Paterson would be a pretty solid starting point for that reason. I think that it is it's a more approachable film. I think it might be a
Yeah.
little bit dry for some, but I think all of Jarmusch's filmography is dry to an extent. So I think it's good to get that dryness out of the way at first. But I also recommend watching Mystery Train immediately after watching Paterson if you liked Paterson, because those two, you could go either way, starting with Mystery Train or Paterson. But I think I'm going to go that Paterson is a good starting place.
I mean, I agree. Usually when I start a series, and this will be the first one of the Jarmusch series, but before I even go back and rewatch all the films or watch for the first time, I try and pick a film for this and then see how it progresses throughout. So initially I had picked Down by Law because that was my first favorite by his. I'd seen Stranger in the Paradise first, and I think I saw Down by Law right after, and then I kind of just made my way through. I think I tried to do it in order. So that was my initial, but then like rewatching Paterson, I was like, this would also be a great place to start. Mystery Train also would be a great place to start. I think for me, when I'm recommending a film, sometimes you cater it to the person if you know them really well to be like, I know this is the one that's going to get you. But if you're doing it on a more neutral, you try and give a film that's going to show what this director has to offer. And I think Paterson's like a great example of that.
I think I think it's Jarmusch working at his best. And
Yeah.
it's really sad that his next film was not as good as Paterson. Not even close. Because I think his next film was The Dead Don't Die. So
I mean, he's got another one coming out. I don't know if it's started filming yet,
I hope so.
but I know this
and
one coming.
I need to see a new Jim Jarmusch movie in theaters because that's a big thing.
Truly.
Because I remember when The Dead Don't Die came out, and I remember seeing the poster and being like, I don't know. And
Yeah.
even though it's not my favorite, I would have loved to have seen it in theaters.
Yeah, this is the well, I've seen other ones in theaters, but not obviously when they came out. Like I've seen Night on Earth, but I wouldn't have seen that.
I did
when
see
it came out.
Mystery Train in 35 millimeter,
Yeah.
and that was an amazing experience. I did not like the Hollywood Theater in Portland is an amazing theater because it'll curate stuff where you're like, why are it's
Hmm.
sometimes they'll show a movie where you're like, really, you're gonna show that? It's so fun because like they do like the usual like 2001 and 70 millimeter stuff
Yeah.
like that, but then they'll also show movies that you wouldn't expect to be shown on film, and it's always a packed house. So if you ever get to see a Mystery Train on 35, I recommend.
No, I'd love to. I saw Paterson, obviously, and then Night on Earth is the only other one I've seen in the cinema so far. So hopefully somewhere in Toronto puts on his other films, but definitely we'll see the new one when that eventually comes out.
Me too.
Second question is a double bill. You can give me one or more films, but what would you pair this one with if you're making a double bill, either for yourself or for someone else? And what's the thematic reasoning behind that pairing?
There is an obvious answer, and I've already mentioned it, so I'm just going to get that out of the way. Mystery Train is the perfect double pairing with Paterson, but I'm going to go with a different film because I'm going to go with some different films because we've already talked about that. This would be a weird pairing, but I've been thinking about this. It's the most recent film we watched for Film Club, and I think there's certain motifs that come together, and it's Hirokazu Kore-eda's Afterlife. I've been thinking about this film a lot, and there's these weird little parallels between these two films. I think the main one is like the structure of days, but it's also about the beauties of life. And I think that both of them touch on similar ideas, but in vastly different ways. They're both these kind of dry, quiet films about the beauties of life, but one is more philosophical in the way that it proposes a lot of its questions, which is Afterlife. And Paterson is more just watching things unfold and taking meaning from that. I think that would be an interesting double bill. But one of the biggest things about Paterson is the small town America feel, and the film that I think worked well in that regard that I think would pair well with Paterson is Columbus, directed by Kogonada, who did After Gang. I think I mispronounced his name, but that's okay. He's a YouTube video essayist turned filmmaker, and Columbus is just like, it's very similar in that it focuses on a small town, and it's a lot like other Jarmusch films where it's like an outsider looking in, because the point is like this character is like stuck in this city, and he like it's about the people he meets along the way. I think that would pair really well with Paterson as well.
I haven't seen that one. I did see After Yang, which I really liked a lot,
Yes,
but I
I
haven't
love
seen anything
After
else
Yang.
by him. So I'm gonna have to add that to the list because that sounds interesting. Those are all great pairings. I also thought of obviously Mystery Train. So, and then the other two I thought of especially on this watch where the first one I thought of was Cléo from 5 to 7, the
Ooh,
Agnès
yes.
Varda, because I think that this is obviously just within one day as opposed to stretched out, but it's her just living her life, and it doesn't seem that remarkable, but there's certain things that happen to her during the day that are remarkable, and it's just a day in her life. And I love those type of movies. I love those like kind of self-contained where it's just like this is just a snippet of someone's life. I don't know what happened to them beforehand. I don't know what's going to happen to them after. It doesn't matter. This is the only important part for me to watch right now. So
Yep.
there was that one. And then I was saying that I kind of associate Jarmusch with Wes Anderson, but the other director I also kind of associate him with is Wim Wenders often. I think they're tied essentially because of Mueller, but they do have similarities. And for some reason, Alice in the Cities came up in my mind as I was watching this. And that's kind of like because I kind of see Paterson a bit kind of like a bit of a road movie at times. And Alice in the Cities is very much a road movie. And they're traveling different cities, which is the opposite of Paterson, but it's just following two people, just what's happening to them. You know, it's not like they're actively on a journey to change their life. It's just that we're following them getting from point A to B. And similar to Paterson, we're following him from, Monday to Sunday and going on there. So I think those would be good pairings.
I haven't seen very much from Wim Wenders, so I can't like make the parallel as much as you can, just because I'm just unfamiliar with his work. I do see the Cléo comparison a lot, and that it's like it's just it's an important aspect of their lives, and it's just like again, it's focusing on average life, but also beauty within. It's so that's an interesting pairing. Never thought about that.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it for some reason on this watch, it really kind of reminded me of that, and I always want to think about a Varda movie in general. But yeah, I think that's Paterson. Josh, thank you so much for coming on and chatting about it, because I think it'll be a great one to open the series up with and hopefully spark people to go back and rewatch it, because I think it's a little bit forgotten, unfortunately. But thank you so much for joining.
I
really appreciate it.
Also, I know that Jim Jarmusch has responded to your posts in the past, so
I know.
This is just my plug. Jim, if you like what I said, you know where to find me.
There you go. Seeing Faces in Movies is an official podcast of the Royal Film Club. It's hosted and edited by Felicia, with intro music by The Marker. If you like what you heard, let us know at seeingfacesmovies.com or send us an email at seeingfacesmovies@gmail.com. And while you're at it, please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to your podcast. And stay tuned for our next episode on Ghost Dog.
Till eternity passes away, just to spend them with you.